You're watching the DSP Leaders Summit on Open RAN, which looks at the increasing importance of the open virtualized radio access network. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content at TelecomTV, and today's panel discussion looks at how to expand the mobile ecosystem with Open RAN. The Open RAN model works if there are sufficient vendors and technology companies all adhering to interoperable standards and specifications to provide mobile operators with the necessary choices. But how do we encourage diversity in the ecosystem and support the full range of large vendors, small companies and innovative startups? Well, that's what we are about to discuss. So let me now introduce our panelists. Joining us from France is Olivier Simon, who is Director of Radio Innovation at Orange. From the UK is Colin Bryce, Director of Mobile Network Engineering at CommScope. From Boston in the US is Fernando Cerioni, VP Product Management and Marketing at Robin.io. And from San Francisco in the US, we are joined by Oğuz Sunay, Vice President R&D Mobility with the ONF, the Open Networking Foundation. Hello everybody, very good to see you all. A broad question to start us off. What exactly is needed from the telecoms ecosystem for Open RAN to work? Do we have any idea of the number of vendors we need and the range of essential technologies? Olivier, what thoughts do you have on the nature of the ecosystem?
Yeah. Actually, the Open RAN ecosystem is quite large because a modern radio system has different pieces. You have the radio unit, you have the CUDU, which is mainly software, you have the infrastructure that is hardware and software, you have system integration, you have the management system. And if you want to realize really the Open RAN concept, you need that on each and every piece of this, there are a sufficient number of players in order to innovate. So it makes probably something like more than 100 or 200 of players that are necessary in the ecosystem. But really the good news is that if you're looking, for instance, at the number of contributors that you have in the RAN Alliance, for instance, we are about something that 230 already. So I would say that for the total number of players, we are already quite good. After that, if you take some specific place, there are for instance, if you take the hardware of the infrastructure, in order to do Open RAN, and especially for 5G, you need acceleration and you need good chipset to do so. And so in this specific area, for instance, you have currently a lower number of actors. But the good news, again, is that it's ramping up and we have more and more, including large players interested in this area. And I really think that it's developing really, really well and really fast.
Great, thank you. Colin, any thoughts from yourself about the nature of the ecosystem we need and where individual players sit?
No, I agree with the comments that have just been made. I think, what we're really seeing in Open RAN, I think, is a lot of concepts that have come out of the IT industry, particularly in terms of virtualization. Applying that to telecoms, clearly from a technology layer works well. But I think the difference between a telecom market and, say, an IT market where you're putting these types of applications in a data center really is the level of robustness that the products need. There's a big difference from having a server that's sitting in a nice air-conditioned data center compared to one that's sitting in a field somewhere in an outdoor shelter or even on the top of a tower. So I think we'll see a large number of vendors, as was mentioned, in the silicon layer, in the software application layer. But I think there will still be a need for the ruggedization of these solutions and getting a number of hardware capable vendors who know how to deploy and deliver telecom applications in the field. And I think the integration of all of these things together is really where the challenge comes, rather than purely the number of vendors.
Thank you. And Fernando, like Colin, you sit inside the ecosystem. What's your inside view in the Open RAN ecosystem?
Well, definitely agree with Olivier and Colin on the comments. One area that is also we've seen extremely important to support that diversity of vendors that we're talking about, open interfaces, open source software contribution, as well as the support of hybrid cloud, right? We're talking about on-premises deployments plus on the public cloud deployments. A component that will be common across all these areas and being able to enable that is a robust infrastructure in play, right? That's one thing what we do, Robin, where we allow you to pick the multiple vendors on the run side, multiple vendors on the infrastructure. That could be, as I say, server vendors or public cloud providers, and being able to deploy these applications across the hybrid cloud with the ability to do this on cloud native or on virtual machines. And on top of that, doing that at scale. One thing that Open RAN brings as a new challenge is the big number of sites. We're talking about data centers that will be near those towers on the far edge in the order of tens of thousands, right? If you take a big network of a tier one, we may be talking about hundreds of thousands. So infrastructure resources, allocation of those applications, and then the service automation end-to-end is what will allow you to do a deployment of this size. Basically hiding the complexity and allowing you to deploy this in a reasonable time frame, right? Which is, we're talking about a big network. It's a big step ahead. So I would say a good infrastructure in place, resource orchestration, automation, and public cloud or hybrid cloud is the key component as well to keep in mind.
Thanks. And Oğuz, from your perspective, from the ONF's perspective, you're used to working with a wide range of telcos and suppliers. What are you seeing is needed from the Open RAN ecosystem?
So when we're talking about the ecosystem, we have to maybe take a step back and talk about what we mean by Open RAN. So we're talking about virtualization and disaggregation, but that disaggregation is effectively going to take place in two dimensions. So far, we have been talking in this panel about the first dimension, which is the horizontal disaggregation, about disaggregating the RAN into RU, DU, and CU components and virtualizing some and then putting them on the cloud. But it is the second dimension that telcos that I speak to label them as the crown jewel of Open RAN, which is the bringing programmability and SDN principles into RAN. And this is really, from an ecosystem perspective, going to be more challenging and more interesting when we get there. So here we're effectively talking about RAN intelligent controllers, both near real time and non-real time. And on those platforms, effectively, we're talking about developing and realizing RAN configuration and control applications. In this case, provided that we create these specifications in a good, solid way, and by that I mean the specifications between the RAN nodes, the disaggregated nodes, and the controller platform, but also, as importantly, the interface between the platform and these control and configuration applications, then I see us moving towards even control and configuration application app stores, akin to maybe what we see in the mobile phone space with Android and iOS. And in this dimension, then we are going to have vendors that are going to be responsible from these controller platforms, and there's going to be a large number of application developers who will want to come onto this ecosystem. And this number is going to potentially explode when we actually start having this dimension in the deployment plans?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that the telco app store is getting a lot of momentum at the moment. But as you say, we are increasing the number of players in the telecoms ecosystem with Open RAN. Colin, is there an established support mechanism or some way for vendors to collaborate and share their ideas and jointly work on challenges?
I think we're seeing certainly that the Telecom Infrastructure Partnership and the ORAN Alliance are thinking about this in terms of the test and integration focus group and some of the community labs that are beginning to be put in place. So I think I like the comments about these two dimensions of Open RAN, and I think in this horizontal domain, I certainly think from a protocol perspective, I can see an ecosystem or a system evolving that's going to make it easy to do the basic integration testing. And recently in September, we had the Plug Fest that was organized by TIP and ORAN. And those types of activities, I think, are definitely helping. The challenge for an individual operator will be, in this vertical domain, how he creates an instance of these applications which work for his particular requirements. So I think in that domain, there probably will have to be greater investment by the telcos themselves to really create a complete working system end to end, including all these new applications that works for them.
Thanks, Colin. And Olivier, from a telco perspective, you being our CSP representative on the panel today, are initiatives like the ORAN Alliance and what TIP's doing, are these organisations the way? Do you get sufficient benefit from bringing together the vendors, other telcos, your peers, and the collaborating and jointly working on ideas and challenges?
Now, actually, I think it was identified from scratch that the Open RAN concept really need some collaboration. You cannot take each and every operator creating their own lab, putting different vendors in this lab, and kind of duplicating, the work for each and every operator. So in the ORAN Alliance, for instance, this topic of how to avoid duplication, how to create a blueprint, for instance, how to create labs that would benefit for all the operator, but also the vendor community, because it's not sustainable for, let's say, a small or a medium-sized vendor to work with like 100 different operators in 100 different labs. So the way I see the thing is that initially you need some collaborative framework, like the Open Test and Integration Center created by ORAN, or the TIP Community Lab that have been created by TIP. And this collaborative framework take a lot of the integration challenge to run IoT testing, to kind of validate that the interface specification are well implemented. And of course, after some time, when you need to implement your own end-to-end system for a given country, you need to go in your own lab and really take your own configuration as an operator and verify that everything's worked properly together. But again, these first steps that is made of a collaborative lab, that is, by the way, most of the time sponsored by a large operator, is really the key success factor for the Open RAN concept to fly, because it avoids probably like 80% of the duplication that you could have if you don't have this kind of let's say collaborative framework that are put in place.
Indeed, and we have a dedicated panel on integration and OTIC later in the week. Moving along, And speaking in general terms now, because I know there are exceptions, telcos are not very good at supporting startups and smaller companies historically. We need this with Open RAN. So how does the industry change its perhaps procurement models and provide a more predictable and financially viable environment for new vendor players? Fernando, I mean, you're a company that is breaking in to this market in a big way. What experience have you got in this? What would you like to see?
Well, I would say there is definitely you will need the startup component into the ecosystem in order to bring innovation, agility, new ways of attacking the problem. Right? I would say if you look at the, I'm just thinking from the point of view of all the new Open RAN or RAN vendors, the well-known like Parallel Wireless, Mavenir, Altiostar, even Airspan. They're all really companies that I think you would name them as they have startup in terms of size, startup in terms of how fast they move and how they are moving the ball forward in some way presenting new ways to solving the problem as compared to the incumbent vendors, I would say. And also I would say I see a robust VC community supporting the creation and growth of those startups that are bringing that innovation, right? We see also other companies, Facebook, I think, along with TIP, as a good example that was mentioned earlier, that they are really helping the community move forward in the sense of common labs, plugfests, even with some operators, right? There are some tier ones, well-known names in Europe or the US where they are participating and encouraging those vendors to work together and bringing those solutions to the market, right? So I would venture to say that without a healthy component of startups and consequently backed by good funding, I don't think that this movement will be possible to move at the speed that the industry needs.
Thank you, Fernando. Colin.
I think that's correct, but I would still divide the whole requirement to develop an Open RAN ecosystem into two parts. And I think one of the reasons that telcos traditionally haven't, let's say, incubated startups in the way that the IT industry has is again this need to have robust scale and the ability to deliver logistically and in terms of installation commissioning broad scale networks very, very quickly. So I think there will be lots of innovation, lots of startup opportunities in this vertical ecosystem, this software application layer that will drive across. But to develop, say, radio units or integrated active antenna units, test them, build plant that deliver them, or even support the logistics from contract manufacturer and roll those out in the tens of thousands that will be required, takes more money than you would normally get through a VC type funding arrangement. So I think a lot of the traditional players will still have a big part to play in that aspect of the Open RAN ecosystem.
Thanks. And Oğuz, you want to come in on that point?
Yes. Telcos are indeed notoriously bad at, have been bad at supporting startups and smaller companies, to the extent that in the VC circles, there is now this common belief that telcos actually kill startups. But with Open RAN, this is changing. And there are two waves behind this movement. One is the new progressive operators like Rakuten and Dish, who are taking bold, courageous steps by betting on new, innovative, smaller companies, and not only by selecting them as vendors, but also by directly funding them. But with incumbent operators, there is the disadvantage of having to support a brownfield network as well. So the progress is naturally slower there. But considering how operators like Vodafone and Telefonica are moving and how active operators like Orange, AT&T, Verizon, China Mobile are in ORAN, it is certain that the appetite is there and things are changing. And this is going to have a reflection on the VC circles as well. I foresee I'm optimistic about this change moving forward.
Great, thanks. And Fernando, back to you.
Yeah, I just agree with what Oğuz said. I think we're just going to mention a good example that we are involved very closely with Robin is this story with Rakuten, right? Rakuten has been extremely, I would say, progressive, bringing their 5G network up and running with many companies that are VCs or, I'm sorry, startup companies. And that's a good example that by picking those companies, they have been able to launch a network that is I would say at the bleeding edge of the technology, right? So I think this is as Oğuz said, fully agree with him, that you're seeing already some concrete examples of these companies taking a combination of big vendors, smaller vendors, and making them work all together. I think, and as other companies, as was mentioned, Telefonica, Vodafone, and others, are on the same line of thought. So I think you're starting to see concrete examples of networks that are going live and are deployed that are making a reality this combination of big and smaller vendors are taking the best of them for when you combine them all, you have a really good solution out there.
Olivier, I'd like to comment, and I'm curious to know what Orange sees its role as in supporting the ecosystem, especially with the smaller and the newer players.
Yeah, so actually the first thing to say is that many large operators like ourselves have their own incubator. For instance, in Orange, we have Orange Fab, that is dedicated to small companies, to acceleration of small companies. We have Orange Ventures, which is dedicated to investment in some companies that could be or could not be our provider. And we are trying to push as much as possible the innovation to get there. But I want to maybe step back a little bit and try to explain why it's kind of heavy to source and deploy a large monolithic network. If you take like a 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G system that you deploy over a country that could be like 50 million people, you have a number of verification, you have thousands of parameters, and the qualification of this big monolithic system is actually very heavy. And I think this is one of the reasons why the operator looks quite heavy and sometimes a little bit in the past. But really, the concept of Open RAN as such will help to make things lighter. And it's something that has happened already in the IT ecosystem. When you start to cut the things into little pieces that you can control much in a much easier manner, then you can spend much less time into, let's say, building a large RFP, into qualifying for months the solution, because simply it's more simple. So I would say that part of the answer is not only about the operator willingness to support startup and to invest. It's also linked with the way the networks are currently built. And I really think that with the Open RAN concept coming into play, it will get much easier. And maybe the operator reputation could change from this perspective. Maybe a last thing to say is that there are different use cases when you are an operator. You have, of course, your large mobile network that you're using for mass market, but you also have indoor system. You also have some rural type of solution that you're deploying in specific areas. You also have private mobile system. And this other use case that are a little bit beside the large public network are easier to implement, easier to control. They are smaller. And it's also a good way, I think, for operators to start and introduce this Open RAN concept quickly without having necessarily built the full system that is really necessary for the public network.
Thank you, Olivier. I'd like to pick up on those points, if I may. Maybe I can start with Colin. This idea of breaking down our solutions into smaller components, smaller services, more manageable. Is this something that would be beneficial to the vendor ecosystem, you think?
I think so, and I think creating common hardware platforms that can be built on, I think, is the start of this, and then layering software applications and things on top. I mean, again, one of the things, if we look at the VC funded success stories in the IT industry, most of them, a lot of them, are based around software applications, and this view that you get something to market early, you put it out there, even if it's not 100% correct, and then you can update it, you can change it, you can test it in the application. That works for software because you can always go back to the previous version, you can withdraw it and come back to a common standard. If you have rolled out 10,000 radios across a country, and then you find there is an endemic failure in those, and you have to go and replace them all, it's a huge cost, and it would kill most startup companies. And that's why the level of engineering that goes into environmental, physical, mechanical robustness, IP testing for weatherproofing, etc. All of that still has to be done in ORAN, and I think those are the areas that perhaps we shouldn't underestimate, and need to be carefully and robustly engineered, and then we can build all this dynamic infrastructure and other applications on top of those. But if we get those wrong, I think we'll struggle to kickstart the move from a proprietary to an Open RAN ecosystem.
Great, thank you, Colin. And Olivier, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, very quickly, I fully agree with what has been said. I think we are talking a lot about the software, which is important because it's maybe where the thing will change the most, but the hardware layers for both radio unit and for both the infrastructure are extremely important and might be even more important in the beginning of the Open RAN concept, because let's take the example of massive MIMO radios. I mean, this type of radios are extremely difficult to design, to build, and you could have a lot of performance difference, both in terms of quality of experience and power consumption, depending on how exactly you engineer it. And it's really important to remind to the ecosystem that this hardware layer will be a key success factor as well of the Open RAN, at least to make it at scale for new technologies like 5G and massive MIMO.
Thank you. Before we finish, I do want to get on to the point of how we pull all this together. When we faced with these Open RAN deployments that comprise multiple components from multiple vendors, what role will external systems integrators have in piecing all the elements together? Oğuz, perhaps I could start with you and some views here, or if they have a role at all.
Sure. They are definitely going to have a role. Effectively with virtualization, not only in the RAN space, but also in the mobile core space, we are seeing the cloud technologies and in general, IT technologies bleed into the telco space. When we look at the big companies in that space, like Amazon or Google or Facebook, they have their own CI/CD processes and they do their own development and integration. And for the telcos, this is at least to a large extent, this is a foreign concept. Whenever you have multi-vendor deployments, And especially in a distributed cloud architecture, operators will definitely need systems integrators to ensure interoperability, troubleshooting, coordinating, also what will essentially become a distributed CI/CD DevOps environment.
Thank you. And Fernando, any thoughts about the role of SIs?
Yeah, I agree with Oz. I think definitely the SIs, in fact, you're seeing on some of the early deployments right now that SIs are involved. The names of the companies like Tech Mahindra, for example, to mention just one. So definitely they do have a role. Agree fully with Oz. They in some way bring either vendors to the table. They bring the capabilities of doing the support. They bring the capabilities of adaptations and even in some cases even interoperability in the terms of putting a network, maybe the pilots before they go into full production. So definitely they have a role to play, maybe increasingly so. And you see some of the big integrators that are even focusing on 5G and mobile operators, companies like even Accenture, which you would not think as a typical SI, they are involved into this as well. So I would say they are a component of the overall ecosystem in addition to the ISV, so the software vendors, the hardware vendors, the hyperscalers or public cloud. And then in some way as a glue of putting multiple components together. So I absolutely agree there.
Great. And Colin, what's your view on this?
No, I agree with the comments that have been made. I won't name names, but in a recent call with one of the big operators who's starting to do trials in Open RAN, we had a smile from one of their senior engineers saying we didn't perhaps appreciate how much the proprietary vendors did in terms of integration. So I think I definitely think we'll see integrators, but both at that software orchestration layer, but also perhaps vendors supporting the integration down at the physical layer as well. So I think again I love this concept of the two layers, the horizontal and vertical, and there'll be the industry ecosystem will provide a core integrated capability for Open RAN, and then each individual telco will have to tailor that with his own set of software applications running in the way in which he wants. And I think integrators will play a part in both those dimensions.
Thank you. And Olivier, last word to you. Is it a case that maybe some of the larger telcos will want to take on some of this work themselves?
Yeah, actually, system integration is not something new for operator, especially the horizontal integration. How to integrate a RAN with a core network, with a management system, and so on, has been really the daily work of many operators, especially large operators used to take that on board, and they are currently taking that on board themselves. I would say for vertical integration, it's a bit different. And here I see that there could be two different situations. For a relatively small operator, I would expect that all this vertical integration is managed by a system integrator with a kind of turnkey mode, because simply the skills and the resources to do so could be far away from this small or medium-sized operator. For large operator, what we see is that it's more balanced. Of course, system integrators have a role. There are different levels of integration. And I think even for very large operator like AT&T, China Mobile, or ourselves, there is really a need for these skills, especially for what has been done in the past and what is done currently by traditional vendors for traditional solutions. However, there is really a willingness, I think, for this operator to avoid to be in a situation where the new lock-in would be with a system integrator that would take everything, and that would create a situation where the vendor lock-in that we could fill with some traditional solution is replaced by a new vendor lock-in that would go with system integrator. So I think all the large operators have in mind the means to let's say at least control this integration and be able to change the system integrator with the good skills internally to do so. I think this will be the balance where it will come, at least for large operators.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And that is all the time we have for our panel today. Thank you all very much for taking part in our discussion. Now, if you haven't already done so, make sure you watch today's 2 keynote interviews where my colleague Ray Lemaitre discusses Open RAN, first with AT&T CTO André Furch, and then Deutsche Telekom's SVP of Technology Strategy and Innovation, Alex Choi, not to be missed. We have plenty more interviews and panel discussions still to come over the next 2 days. But next we have our live Q&A programme, which is scheduled for 4:30 p.m. UK time today. And this is your chance to quiz our guests and panelists and to air your views on Open RAN. So please get in touch now using the form here on the website. There's also a link you can use to add the session to your calendar. For now though, thank you very much for watching and goodbye.